Hi guys, Josh Lloyd here, answering one of your questions regarding Dynasty Leagues. The Dynasty League stuff, we're going to continue doing that obviously through the season, but the player spotlights that you guys would have seen in the regular podcast are going to be as short little segments here in the Dynasty podcast, focusing more on their long-term value. So that's what's going to be happening during the season as we do player spotlights, and we'll end up getting through quite a lot of players. Still be taking some requests for those guys as well as the season it kicks off. But now I've got a question that has come through from a follower on Twitter, and that follower is Thomas Pettersson. Thomas, I'm going to hope that you're from Iceland, because for some reason my son's favorite country is Iceland, and I see the sun at the end of your name, and I'm just hoping, so let me know whether that is the case. His question is, I'm just curious to how you judge players differently when it comes to dynasty versus redraft leagues. How much different would your projections be if it were based on dynasty outlook and not just next year? It's a good question, Thomas, and I get it all the time regarding how you view guys in dynasty versus how you view those guys. Now, we're still working on ways to algorithmically and mathematically be able to project those players. That's why I talk a lot about the Jacob Goldstein's peak PIPM and try and tie that through to fantasy value. And I'm still working on systems to make sure this works correctly. But what you'll find in dynasty leagues, when you're doing initial drafts in dynasty leagues, is that people go super hard on young players, unproven young players. You'll see guys like DeAndre Ayton, Luka Doncic, taken inside the top 20 in many of these scenarios. You'll see guys like Trae Young inside the top 40, and players who are probably getting chosen too high based on what they may become. If I use one of the new Dynasty Leagues that I started up this season, the Red Rock 12-team Dynasty League Derek Harper division, and look at some of the values of where these young players went, you had it's a pretty standard top of the draft. Nikola Jokic going at number 3 maybe was somewhat of a surprise to some people. But you had Devin Booker going at 14, Donovan Mitchell going at 15. But then you look at guys like Luka Doncic at 22, Jason Tatum at 23, the future MVP Kyle Kuzma went at 24, Triple J, Jaren Jackson went at 25, and that's the same team that took Kuzma. So they went with Davis at pick 1. And then at the end, pick 24, 25 with Jaren Jackson, you had the Baptist John Collins at 27. I'm just picking these young guys that stand out. Lauri Markkanen at 35, DeAndre Ayton at 39, which actually is a pretty good pick, I think, at that spot. Markelle Fultz at 47. Rondé Hollis-Jefferson at 48. Guys taking some pretty big steps up in terms of where they're not necessarily projected to go, but how they're viewing them for long-term dynasty value, and taking a risk in that sort of a situation. So in terms of how I judge them, I tend to look at dynasty leagues with a 2 to 3 year window normally, and look at guys who I think are going to be able to produce pretty solid numbers in those times. Now, a lot of rookies in that time won't be producing solid numbers in 2 to 3 years. And I'm not saying that I avoid rookies, because honestly, if they're there, I'm looking at them. But I'm not taking someone at pick 20 who hasn't played a game in the NBA yet. I'd rather get the guy who I think for the next 3 years can be a top 20 player. Now, if a guy is, say, 30, 29 maybe, then in terms of looking at it from a 2 to 3 year window, I'm starting to downgrade that player, because that's when declines can happen. I also look at the way that guys' contracts are structured a little bit as well. Are they becoming a free agent that might see them struggle to get a role moving forward? What's their demand going to be like? Are they going to be getting a contract? Are they going to still be an in-demand player? In general, players are improving through to about age 27, 28, and then they keep about the same through about 29, maybe 30, a drop off, but after 30, declines come, and they can start to come pretty quickly. So when you're looking at those sort of players who aren't the elite of the elite, LeBron James, James Harden, those sort of guys, then you're looking for declines around that area. So guys, rightfully so, like Chris Paul, are suffering pretty significant drop-offs in this situation. And Chris Paul, in this, to reference back to this dynasty draft, he went at pick 44, but you can still get value. Someone like Paul George, who's still in the middle of his prime, went at pick 19 in this draft, where realistically you could be looking at him at the end of the first round as a relatively young player. We had Jimmy Butler go at pick 28, and that was before we knew about this situation in Minnesota. And I guess because he is 29, that maybe you're looking at 2 prime years, and that's a fair enough type of decision to look at guys in that sort of regard who may start to drop off at that point in their career. But in terms of projecting guys, you're looking at players who have a peak at around age 27, 28. you do want to factor in youth, but you don't want to go too hard on youth a lot of the time, because we, especially guys who haven't played in the NBA, we have seen time and time again lottery picks screw up and not be good. And if you're taking that risk on them, you're taking Marvin Bagley at pick number 60 when we don't know if he's going to be the guy that is busts out and becomes not worth a top 200 pick. You can go back through any NBA draft and have a look at these guys and find players who struggle. The last season, Markelle Fultz, we know how bad he was. Josh Jackson, he also wasn't good. De'Aaron Fox also wasn't good. Frank Ntilikina struggled. Zach Collins at pick 10, he wasn't a great option, but he probably would have been picked in the top 100 in a dynasty draft. The year before, Dragan Bender at pick 4. That didn't work out. Marquise Chris at pick 8. Also didn't work out. Thon McCurr at pick 10. I don't think that's going to work out. And these are all guys that are they get overvalued. The 2015 draft. Jahlil Okafor at number 3. Pretty obviously didn't work out. Hazonia at 5. Cauley Stein at 6, Moutier at 7, Stan Johnson at 8, Frank Kaminsky at 9. All of these guys would have been significantly overrated in a dynasty draft based on the unknown of what their value is going to be. And it does put you at a disadvantage when you waste a top 50, top 60, top 70 pick on one of these guys who never pans out. In terms of how my projections would look, again, I do generally go in and draft based off this season's numbers with guys getting significant discounts. But if I'm there and Chris Paul's sitting there at pick 55 in an initial dynasty draft, I'll grab him and I'll really try and push forward and win, get the prize money this year, and then maybe look at a rebuild 2 years down the track. Because winning a dynasty league, especially in a deeper type thing, 20 teams, it's not an easy thing to do. So if you've got the opportunity to scoop up 3-4 rounds worth of value, 50 spots worth of value on a player, just because in 2 years' time they may not be good anymore, but that gives you a chance to win now, I think you've got to do it. Now, that doesn't mean sacrificing the future and just mortgaging all of your draft picks to be able to do that. And selling some of them off can be good, and depending on how your league is set up, that might be an idea in terms of selling some future assets to completely win now, but you've got to be all in on that sort of thing. But you'll find that young players get significantly overrated when we're looking at it, or there's a lot of hope being put onto these guys that they're going to turn out to be these players that we all know we're going to get 30-40% bust rate of top 10 draft players, of guys who don't turn out to be any good, and that can obviously screw up a dynasty team. Whereas guys who are, there's 20 to 30 guys at the moment, Bradley Beal, perhaps you're looking at someone like Drew Holiday, perhaps it is Paul George, and you're going to get that sort of production for the next 2 to 3 years, and you're going to be feeling pretty good. But look at guys, the first 2 years of an NBA player's career, they're not that good. 3 to 4 when they start to step up, but it's really years 6 to 7 that they start to really push in to become solid players, and that's the peak level of an NBA player's career. And then it's the perfect intersection between increasing mental ability and decreasing physical ability. And then after that, while the mental and understanding of the game tends to improve, the body's ability to process that information at an acceptable level does start to drop off after, say, age 29, 30, and that's when that value drops away. So that's the way I like to look at it, Thomas, is I like to draft for the now in a major aspect. Someone like LeBron, I wouldn't take him in the top 10, but if he's sitting there at pick 18, I would grab him. And I would take that, and then I would try and build more of a win now situation around it. Say in this draft, LeBron went at pick 13. I think that's totally fine to grab LeBron there. We also had Steph Curry at pick 12, which I think is fantastic value with the team that grabbed both of those guys there. And he was still able to grab some younger players. Jamal Murray in round 4. He grabbed Wendell Carter in round 6 because he had that really solid value base early on. And so I'm not going to be the person who comes in here and takes Doncic at pick 15 or takes Ayton at pick 16 or anything like that. And while they may get to that level, they also may not. It is hard to find players. It is hard to be a top 10 player in the NBA. So if someone is currently a top 10 or top 15 fantasy, in general, they're going to stick there pretty regularly. and getting into that area, yeah, might be a tough thing. Now, you might have taken Karl Anthony Towns at pick 40 in a dynasty league 4 years ago, and now he's like a top 2, top 3 type of guy. And of course, there is value there, but you've also got to balance it up against the downside of taking Jahlil Okafor at pick 40, and now he's not really even in the league anymore, and that is somewhat of a risk. It's more of a ballsy strategy, and you can do that. I tend to go the other way because there tends to be definite value that presents by grabbing some of these players that fall, but really bearing in mind that drop-off zone around the age of 30 is something to bear in mind. And I usually look at things with somewhat of a 3-year window. So players who are 30 at the moment, they're probably guys I'm starting to avoid. If the value's still there, I will grab them. 27 is right on the sweet spot of where you're looking at the age of those guys. So that's how I like to look at them. Still working on algorithmic and mathematical stuff to try and be able to project these guys' stats out. But so much of projecting players' stats out is situation dependent, and NBA teams changing over 6 or 7 guys on a roster every 2 to 3 years means that the context in which these guys play, who they're playing with, what their role is, changes so dramatically. So we can do projections on per minute basis of how guys will likely decline and move forward, and their advanced numbers, how that looks at, which is what I'm looking at with the peak PIPM stuff, looking at these players becoming so good that they have to force themselves into larger roles. And you can, I've got a whole bunch of fantasy correlations with that peak PIPM stuff as well that you can ask me about. But that's the way that I tend to look at it, Thomas. So yeah, that's it for today's little dynasty segment. See you guys.